Okay, so you sent us this book, right? The Crisis of the Modern World by Rene Guenon.
Yeah, if you had a chance to,
Oh, yeah, big time. I mean, we went through excerpts, the preface, really tried to get a feel for the structure of the arguments and all that.
cool, cool.
Yeah.
So are we thinking kind of like grading the overall take on the world, like early 20th century vibes and all that?
Yeah, exactly. I think what's really interesting is how he approaches these big ideas, tradition, modernity, and then that whole East-West dynamic.
Right, right. I mean, it's not exactly light reading.
Haha, no, definitely not. But I think there's a lot there that really resonates with like the conversations we're having even now?
For sure. It's like he was picking up on some pretty deep currents that are like
Yeah.
even more obvious now.
Totally. So maybe for those listening who aren't super familiar with Guénon, could you give us a little bit of background?
Yeah, sure. So he was a French intellectual writing in the early 1900s. And what's interesting is he wasn't just looking at things from a purely academic perspective.
Right, like a historian or something.
Exactly. He was really into metaphysics, like the deep questions about the nature of reality. And he was particularly interested in what he saw as like this underlying unity in different spiritual traditions.
That's the esoterism thing, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So the crisis of the modern world is kind of his like big statement about where he saw things going wrong, especially in the West. He's calling for like a total rethink.
Okay, so that's the setup. Now let's get into some of these big ideas. What about this idea of cyclic decline? That seems pretty core to his whole argument.
Oh yeah, definitely. So he believed in these cyclic laws that govern history, right?
Hmm.
And his observation was that things are generally moving downwards. It's like a gradual drift away from the original principles, the source of things.
So it's almost the opposite of how we usually think about progress.
Totally. It's not about things getting better and better, but rather there's this like movement away from the highest point.
Okay, I'm following. But what does that even look like, this downward movement?
So he uses this really cool analogy. Imagine like a heavy object falling. The further it falls, the faster it goes, right?
Yeah, I see where you're going with this.
So Guénon sees this fall as a kind of progressive um, materialization, a growing distance from like pure spirituality.
Okay, so when he talks about spirit and matter, is he using those terms like how we use them today?
It's a bit tricky. He's not just talking about spiritualism versus materialism in the like philosophical sense. It's more symbolic for him.
Okay, so more like different levels of reality.
Exactly. Spirit represents like the primordial state,
Yeah.
pure based on principles, the
Mm.
origin.
Okay, so that's the high point, the beginning, and then things kind of fall from there.
Yeah. But here's the thing. While this downward cycle might sound kind of negative, Guénon actually sees it as a necessary part of a much bigger picture.
Like it's just part of how things work.
Exactly. It's like the seasons. You winter, which is a kind of decline, but it's essential to the whole cycle,
Hmm.
right?
Makes sense. But does that mean we just accept it passively?
No, not at all.
Hmm.
In fact, he argued that understanding this cyclic nature should actually motivate us to, you know, prepare for the end of this current dark age, which he thought was pretty close.
Wow, okay. And this equilibrium thing, like the interplay of different forces.
Yeah, that's another key idea. It's like this constant push and pull that keeps things, more or less balanced.
Okay, so Guidon's view is a little complex, but not totally bleak, right? He's just placing our current situation within this big picture, this grand framework. Now, what about his perspective on history itself? Where does he see the origins of the modern world?
Well, he traces it back to classical antiquity, ancient Greece and Rome.
So there's a connection there.
Yeah, but he's quick to point out that it's not a straightforward thing.
Right.
He calls the modern world an unfaithful continuation, like we lost something important along the way.
We lost that intellectual and spiritual core, right?
Exactly. And then he gives a lot of weight to Christianity's role in transforming the ancient world. It's interesting how he sees parallels between that time and ours, especially this idea of disordered messianism, like a kind of messed up sense of spiritual purpose.
Oh, wow. That's a good point. And the Middle Ages, how does he see that period?
So he focuses on what he calls the real Middle Ages, roughly from Charlemagne to the 14th century.
And he thinks we misunderstand that era.
Big time.
Yeah.
He argues that we fail to appreciate its intellectual depth, like we have this cartoonish view of it as the Dark Ages.
Right, right. So he sees the true beginning of the modern crisis. When?
The 14th century, That's when he sees the breakdown of that unified Christian worldview, the rise of distinct national identities, and the end of the feudal system.
So he's placing it way earlier than the Renaissance.
Right. And he argues that the Renaissance and Reformation were actually results of this earlier decline, like not a step forward, but a deeper fall, a real break with the traditional spirit.
Wow, that really flips the script on how we usually think about history. So if the Renaissance wasn't this rebirth of intellectualism, how do you see it?
He calls it the death of many things. He argues that they just took the outer shell of Greco-Latin civilization, like the texts and the art styles.
But the deeper meaning was lost, right?
Exactly. And he points out that the traditional sciences of the Middle Ages, the ones based on this very different understanding, they basically disappeared.
And nothing really replaced them, at least not on the same level.
That's his point. He calls it the rise of profane philosophy and profane science.
So what's profane in this context? Like, is it bad?
Well, he sees it as a negation of true intellectuality. It basically limits knowledge to the observable world, cutting it off from any deeper principles.
So it's knowledge without wisdom, sort of?
Kind of. He argues that this leads to, like, a bunch of pointless facts and theories without any real grounding.
And he thinks that modern civilization's only real achievement is in
Practical applications. Technology.
right, but even that he sees as
Seriously enviable. Yeah.
because it's come at the cost of higher pursuits, right?
Exactly. And it contributes to this this materialistic focus that he sees as, like, a huge problem.
So this shift in thinking, this forgetting of the medieval worldview, he sees it as happening pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, by the 17th century, he's like, people barely remembered it. He finds it strange how fast that happened.
Almost like it was deliberate.
Right. He even talks about the possibility of some kind of directing will behind it, though he's not sure exactly what that would be.
That's an interesting thought. He also points to some odd things, like how innovations that were already known, things like printing and the Americas, were suddenly hailed as new discoveries.
Yeah, and that whole Dark Ages narrative, he thinks that was pushed to fit a certain view of history, you know?
To make the modern world seem better by comparison.
Exactly. So for Guenon, the modern age isn't just a different era. It's like a total inversion of what came before.
Right, like it's built on the things that earlier civilizations considered unimportant. And that leads us to another key theme, the East-West dynamic. So how does Guenon view that relationship?
It's central to his critique.
Yeah.
He sees this huge gulf between East and West, but he's not just talking about cultural differences.
Yeah, right. It's deeper than that.
Yeah. His point is that traditional civilizations, even though they have their own forms, are ultimately based on the same principles.
So that underlying unity is there.
Yeah, and this big opposition we see now between East and West, it's unique to the modern world.
Okay, so it's more a clash of worldviews.
Exactly, mentalities. And what's fascinating is that he argues the medieval Western mindset was actually closer to the East than it is to the modern West.
Oh, wow. So the modern West is like the outlier.
Yeah. He sees it as this reversal of the normal trend.
Okay, so when he talks about Western mentality, he really means modern mentality, right?
Yeah, and Eastern mentality is the continuation of that traditional way of thinking.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about those modern traditionalist movements in the West? How did he view those?
Not so favorably. He thought they often missed the point, you know? And sometimes even had this hostility towards the East.
So they were creating their own kind of pseudo-traditions.
Exactly. For Guenon, a real revival of Western tradition has to connect with the living traditional spirit in the East.
Like, there needs to be that genuine exchange.
Yeah. He thought that Western intellectuals needed to draw on that deeper wisdom to, revitalize the surviving forms of Western tradition.
But that requires a pretty deep understanding, right?
Definitely. He talks about recognizing the fundamental identity beneath the surface differences.
And he thought that could only be achieved through
pure intellectuality, like a direct grasp of those first principles.
So for Guenon, if the West went back to its roots, the opposition with the East would basically disappear.
Yeah, because that opposition comes from the West's deviation from those shared principles.
Okay, so it's not about the East versus the West. It's about modernity versus tradition.
Right. And it's not about attacking the West. It's about rescuing it from its own, self-destructive tendencies.
So where does this overemphasis on action in the West come into play? I know Guenon talks a lot about that.
Yeah, he's very critical of it. He sees it as a major imbalance, like we've lost touch with contemplation and the pursuit of real knowledge.
So it's action at the expense of understanding.
Exactly. And he connects that directly to the denial of anything beyond the physical world.
Like, we can't even conceive of it anymore.
Right. It's a complete contrast to the Eastern perspective, where contemplation and understanding principles are so important.
And he sees this leading to a kind of pointless activity, right? Just
Yeah.
constant change without any real direction.
Yeah. And it all ties back to materialism. Matter is all about division and separation, which leads to conflict.
Whereas moving towards spirituality is about moving towards unity.
Exactly. Through understanding those universal principles, he even critiques some Western philosophies that try to address these issues,
Yeah.
like Bergson's pure duration.
He doesn't think they go far enough.
No. He sees them as missing that deeper level of intellectual intuition.
Okay, so this rejection of intuition, that's what blocks a real understanding of tradition and the East.
That's what he argues.
Okay, and how does this all play out in the realm of knowledge and science? I know he makes a big distinction between sacred and profane science.
Yeah, so sacred science for Guenon is rooted in metaphysics and principles, trying to understand the deeper meaning of reality.
And profane science.
It limits itself to the observable world, just facts and experiments.
He uses the example of physics,
Yeah.
right?
He points out that originally physics meant the study of nature as a whole.
But now it's just one little specialized field.
Exactly. And he sees that as symbolic of the whole problem with modern science. It's become so fragmented.
So it's lost its connection to those deeper principles and meaning.
Yeah, he even compares it to the separation of temporal and spiritual authority, like how that's led to a loss of legitimacy.
Okay. And the rise of experimental sciences. How does he see that?
Well, he thinks it fits perfectly with the modern obsession with the material world and practical applications.
He even suggests that some modern sciences are basically degenerate forms of ancient sciences,
Right, like astrology became astronomy, alchemy became chemistry.
losing that deeper symbolic level.
Exactly. He thinks it's all about ignorant knowledge now without any real aim.
And I know Guenon sees individualism as a major culprit in all of this.
Oh yeah, he sees it as the root of the anti-traditional attitude.
Because it rejects anything that goes beyond individual opinion.
Yeah, and he ties it to the Protestant Reformation, that emphasis on free criticism.
Leading to a kind of religious free-for-all.
Exactly. He traces a whole progression from rationalism in philosophy to sentimentalism in religion.
Where feeling and personal experience become the ultimate authority.
Right. And he argues that Protestantism, even though it claims to uphold revelation, undermines it through individual interpretation.
So it's anti-traditional at its core.
That's his argument. He sees the modern individual as trying to be the measure of all things, which leads to chaos.
Okay, and when it comes to the social order, what does Guenon see as the main problems?
He says that nobody's in the right place anymore. Like, we've lost that traditional understanding of social roles.
Those natural hierarchies based on aptitude.
Yeah. And he's very critical of modern dogmas like equality and progress.
He sees them as blocking any real discussion of principles.
Exactly. And he analyzes how language and emotional appeals are used to manipulate the masses.
So it's bypassing reason and appealing to sentiment.
Yeah. And this rejection of hierarchy, he says, leads to incompetence in positions of power.
Additionally in politics, right?
Right, because in the democratic system, power supposedly comes from below.
But he thinks that's fundamentally flawed.
Yeah. He argues that the higher can't come from the lower.
And he connects us to materialism again. The people can't give power they don't have.
Exactly. And he critiques the whole idea of universal suffrage, where the majority is supposed to rule.
Even though they might not have the competence.
Right. And he sees individualism and collectivism as ultimately serving the same agenda, undermining those higher principles.
So the solution is?
A restoration of true intellectuality and the formation of a real elite.
But that's something that's missing in the modern West.
Yeah.
Okay, and what about materialism itself? Guenon goes pretty deep on that.
Yeah, so he traces how the meaning of materialism shifted over time, narrowing to the idea that only matter exists.
But he sees a broader, more practical kind of materialism at play, right?
Yeah, like a mindset where material things and concerns are the absolute priority.
Even if people don't consciously subscribe to the philosophy.
Right. He sees this in modern science, this focus on the material world.
So it's more about what we focus on and value.
Yeah, and he argues that we've lost the ability to even conceive of things beyond the senses.
And he's critical of certain spiritualist and idealist philosophies.
He thinks they're often just materialism in disguise.
Still trapped in that separation of mind and matter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he points out how even religion has become more about outward forms and less about inner transformation.
So it's this focus on quantity over quality, action over contemplation.
Yeah, and he sees the Anglo-Saxon obsession with sports as a symptom of this decline.
Like valuing the human animal above all else.
Right. And he notes that this whole modern mess, which started in the West, is now spreading to the East.
It's like a virus.
Kind of. And it's not just about political or economic domination anymore. It's about influencing minds.
Creating these westernized individuals.
Yeah, and while they might be loud, he doesn't think they represent the majority in the East.
More like a vocal minority.
Yeah, and he suggests that the traditional spirit in the East is kind of withdrawing, like it's retreating.
Okay, so it's the West that's really the problem here.
That's his argument.
Yeah.
He sees the modern worldview as inherently Western.
So even Easterners who adopt it are basically westernized in their thinking.
Right. And even movements like nationalism, which seem opposed to the West, are actually using Western methods.
So it's like fighting fire with fire.
Yeah, and he argues that the West is ultimately responsible for its own problems.
And it's now exporting those problems to the rest of the world.
Exactly. He sees it as imposing its worldview on the East.
And he's not a fan of how the West portrays the East. Right?
Yeah. He critiques those superficial or distorted accounts.
And his own aim was to present authentic Eastern ideas to the West.
Yeah, but only for those who are capable of really understanding.
Okay, so to wrap things up, what are the key takeaways from Guénon's critique of the modern world?
Well, in a nutshell, he sees it as a deviation from tradition, marked by this downward movement, the dominance of profane knowledge, individualism, social chaos, and materialism.
And he emphasizes that fundamental clash between the modern West and the traditional East.
Yeah, and the need for the West to rediscover its own tradition through connection with the East.
And the importance of intellectual intuition and those higher principles. So for those listening, I think understanding Guénon's framework can be really helpful, even if you don't agree with everything he says.
It's about seeing things from a different perspective.
Yeah, and questioning those assumptions we often take for granted.
And maybe even finding some solutions to the problems he identifies.
Right. So here's a thought to leave you with. Given Guénon's analysis, do you see any trends or movements today that represent either a continuation of this dark age he describes, or maybe the beginnings of a way out?
Like, is the shipwreck inevitable, or are there signs of a new world emerging?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Rene Guénon's ideas. It's definitely some food for thought. If you're interested in exploring further, I highly recommend checking out his work. It's a perspective you won't often hear, and it might just change the way you see the world.